Welcome to Sitecore as a content repository using Entity Service and Speak. So, what is Entity Service? To explain this, we're going to go up one level and have a look at Sitecore.Services.Client. Entity Service sits within this namespace. So, Sitecore.Services.Client is a way of creating ASP.NET Web API-based web services. It uses a framework and some scaffolding to create those services. It means we're always going to be creating those services in a consistent way. It provides both a framework on the server side for creating those web services and then a client-side framework as well for consuming those services, but you can consume them without using JavaScript, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Within this namespace, there are two services. Firstly, there's item service. So item service is very similar to web item API we have currently. It allows us to work with standard Sitecore items and gives us functionality such as add an item, querying some items out, there's a search functionality in there, and authentication and stuff like that. When you need a little bit more power, you actually go to Entity Service. So Entity Service allows you the full control over creating your business entity that you want to expose over that service, specifying which fields and things you want to expose, and also allows you to write the implementation code for working with that service, such as creating your item, deleting an item, and so on. So a couple of uses for this could be importing content into Sitecore from a third-party system, or actually querying data out of Sitecore on your website or another third-party system. In this demo application that I'm going to show you a little bit, we're going to be using Sitecore Speak, and we're going to be pulling content in and out of Sitecore using Entity Service. So a little bit about configuration first. All the configuration for Sitecore.Services.Client and Entity Service is within this config file here. It has everything to do with our security access, so which user we access our service under. We can enable and disable anonymous access. We can add custom and standard authorization filters. All our routing for our services are in here, and all the pipelines as well. It's worth taking into account that anything you change within this config file will reflect across all your services within Sitecore.Services.Client. Okay, let's jump on to actually creating the service and the steps and the parts of Entity Service. So firstly, we have our entity. So as I said, this is our business entity or our model that we describe and define ourselves, and this is what gets exposed over the service, what we work with. You must implement this entity identity-based class. So this is within the Sitecore Services core DLL, which you need to reference in your project first. This gives you the base functionality of Entity Service of a model that you need to implement. So it has an ID. So this could be the ID of your Sitecore item in the content tree. It could be the ID of a third-party piece of data if you're exposing something different over an Entity Service. It also gives you a path property. This could be the path to a REST call to get more information on that particular item. It could be the path to the item in the content tree, for example. We also have the possibility to add standard .NET validation attributes to properties of our model. So we can say whether a property within that entity or model is required, whether we want to find a little bit of regular expression to validate that, and so on. And it's worth noting that that validation will fire both on the server side and the client side, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We also have the support for adding custom client-side validation, so you can write some JavaScript that will fire on the client side to actually validate your model as well. The biggest part of Entity Service is our repository. So Sitecore sticks to the repository pattern for working with your entity. So you have this one central place, central class of everything you need to do with your entity, so such as querying them, adding one, deleting one, and the full CRUD layer. Once you add this iRepository interface in, all the scaffold will pull in and you'll give you all the functionality for the service, and then we can write our own business logic to basically have full control over each of those methods and what they're going to do for us. The last piece is our controller. So all the functionality of the service is actually defined within our repository. We simply decorate our controller with this services controller, which actually tells Sitecore that this is going to be a Sitecore Services Client service. We then simply implement entity service of our entity. So that's the entity we built in our first step. This is our base class, and then this base class will handle all the calls coming in from our REST calls or JavaScript into the controller, and then we'll pass those calls off then into our repository that'll actually do the work. The service is really flexible. It's easily extended, so we can add additional actions into that controller if we wish to. And if you want to restrict down the access to this particular controller, that's all done with standard authorization filters, so there's nothing custom there. Let's jump into Sitecore. I'll show you what we're going to try and build in this demo. So the first thing we have here is a project that I was thinking of to explain Entity Service. It's basically a way of using Sitecore as a content repository. So we store all our content in Sitecore, reusable code chunks. They could be stuff that's on our website or email campaigns or so on. And we start to surface that out and use it in different ways. So in this application here, we're going to start to build brochures. So we're going to allow the user a clean interface where they can enter pieces of content, sort of title, an introduction, and so on. We're going to then allow the user to pick some content that's currently in Sitecore. So we're going to have some case studies and some images. And then we're going to mash all that together and we're going to generate a PDF at the end. So just to show you what we plan to use Entity Service for on this application. So this area here, this is going to have a list of all our brochures within our system. So we're just going to list them out. We're going to have an edit function, so you can click an item and switch into an edit view. A delete function, so we can delete an existing brochure. And then we also have the create view. So this view here is what I was just talking about, where we can enter the title. We have a date picker to choose a date. Enter an introduction. We can select a case study that's currently in Sitecore. Select some images, and then we either save, which will create this in Sitecore for us to reuse later. We can generate a PDF version using this content that's been selected, and if we're in the edit view, the save will just update that brochure in the system. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do here is do a bit of live coding. We're going to code our model, our repository, our controller, and I'll talk a little bit about inversion of control containers and how I get them working in Entity Service. So let's jump into Visual Studio. So as you can see here, we have an empty class. This is going to be our brochure. So this is going to define the entity that we're going to return over Entity Service. So the first thing we need to do is implement entity identity. So this is the base class is required for a entity or a model that's exposed over Entity Service. So just jump in that base class quickly. So you can see these are the properties I was talking about earlier that are required. So we have an ID. So this, as I said, this could be the ID of the Sitecore item. Also our URL, which could be the path to the item in the content tree. So what we have to do here is actually define the properties that we want to expose for our entity. So to do that, if I jump into Sitecore first to show you what we need. So as you can see, we have our item here. So these fields match up to the create view I show here. So we have our title, an introduction, a drop tree for our case study, a drop tree to select an image, and we have our date picker. So basically we want to add all those fields to our entity. So not to bore you to death, I have some code here to bring in that model. So if we start down here, we have our title, introduction, case study, which is a GUID, our image, also a GUID, and our date is a date time. So these are the fields we want to expose from our item. We also have an icon. So this is just the icon within Sitecore that's been used for this template type. Even though the ID is in the entity identity base class, some of the speak components, such as the list, the tree view, the list control, and combo boxes, require item ID like this with a lowercase I. Is actually used for its selected item events. So when you select an item in a tree view and you want to subscribe to that event, that's what's expected there. So I'm just simply returning the ID from the base class just to get some of the speak components working correctly. So the next thing we need to do is actually write our repository. So if we jump in here, so I have a class, empty class ready to go. So the first thing we need to do here is implement a repository of the entity. So this is our brochure we just created. So if we implement that interface, implement our missing members. So that's just a bit of resharper going on there. You can see this is the functionality we get by default for entity service. So you can see we're always going to be building these services in a consistent way. So this interface brings in the exact functionality we need to create. So we have our getAll, which returns a list of our brochures and iQueryable. We got a find by ID, so we pass a string ID, we return a single brochure, and we write that code. We have add, where we pass in that brochure entity, check with whether one exists already, update functionality, and delete. And you can see here we have the power now to write that implementation code exactly how we want it to work, so we've got full control over that. So again, I've got some code here, so if I just delete this, so basically what I've done here, just to run you through quickly, this is just basically I pull all the functionality out and put them in separate classes, and then use the dependency injection to inject in those dependencies. So we got separate classes to do our reading, updating, creating, and so on. So basically all this code here is standard Sitecore code. So our getAll method is that base class, that class there is actually just performing a Sitecore content search to return those. Find by ID, again, is content search. Add, standard code to add a Sitecore item. Exist is firing a query under the hood, content search query. And the update and delete, again, a standard Sitecore code to work with Sitecore items, so there's nothing too special there. So, because I'm using dependency injection here, I will show you how that works in a little bit once we've created a controller. But at the moment, that's our code for our repository, so that will work. So the final thing we need to do is actually create our controller. So if we jump into our empty class here, the first thing we need to do is decorate this with services controller. So if we do that, so that's now marking up as part of entity service. And what we need to do in this controller is actually tell Sitecore which entity and which repository we want to work with in this controller. So to do that, we need to use entity service, and then we wire up our entity in. So that's our brochure in this example. Okay, so if we implement that base class, you can see this constructor's now been added. So as you can see here, we're taking in an iRepository of our brochure and we're then passing that into our base. So the base class entity service here does all the mappings. So when the request comes in from your REST service, your JavaScript, it'll take that request, it'll do all the mappings and things, and then it'll pass that across to the repository, which actually does the work. So as you can see here, we're using our interface, so we're not actually haven't actually got our concrete instance of our class here. So this is where dependency injection comes in. So we obviously need to resolve that iRepository and actually put that off to our brochure repository, which is our concrete instance of that class. So I'll show you how that works. So I use structure map as my dependency injection IOC container, sorry. So what I have firstly is I have a registry. This is standard structure map code. This is basically how we map each of our interfaces to our concrete instance of our class. So the only one we need to take into account here to explain is our repository. So here we're saying for our iRepository of our brochure, we want to use this concrete instance of a class here, so our brochure repository. So that's the mapping done here. The other thing we need to do is actually create a dependency resolver. So iDependency resolver is part of .NET, so this is what it will use to try and resolve our dependencies. So basically we implement this interface here, and then we can write the code for our particular IOC container to allow us to resolve those dependencies. So this is the one for structure map. So we have methods in here to get our instance So when we pass in our interface, which class comes back out. So all that code's in there. You can find these on GitHub for all your IOC containers. They're standard code. The last thing we need to do is actually get that to work with Sitecore. So the way I've done that, so we've got my config file here. Within the initialized pipeline, I've got a processor, and this is going to be where I create my instance of my IOC container and actually get .NET to call that. So if I jump into this class, so you can see what I've done here in the process method here, which is the standard that's in a Sitecore pipeline, in this pipeline anyway. What we want to do is get the global configuration. We then create a new instance of our IOC container. We pass in our registry, which is all those mappings. And then we set our dependency resolver to whichever dependency resolver you're using for our given IOC container. So every time this application starts, it's going to configure my IOC container for me. And then it will automatically, when this controller is created, it'll hit the constructor and it'll actually resolve that dependency. Okay. Okay, now we've created our service. There's three ways we can consume it. Firstly, we can call that REST Service API directly, so just standard REST calls. We can consume the service using our JavaScript API, so this comes part of Entity Service, and I'll go into a little bit more depth in a bit. And then we have some Speak components as well that allows us to consume that service. Just a note that these come with Sitecore 7.5 and above, so this was introduced there. We have routing within our, the standard routing, for our service is defined like this. So we have our hostname, /Sitecore/API/SSC. So SSC is our prefix for entity service, so everything will be in this route. We then have the namespace to our controller. So anything that's a dot we replace with a hyphen. And then we go /controller and then also /action to get that as well, with an optional ID on the end. So we'll just call that service now just to check that our service is working. So if we just build this firstly, to check it builds, we're already up to date. Not sure why, let me just rebuild. Great. Just wait for Sitecore to pre-compile. So while that's requesting, we'll just build up the URL. So we have /Sitecore/API/SSC/ then we have our namespace to our controller. So in this example, it's Mike Robbins /@/controllers, and then we have our controller name, which is brochure. So we hit that. As you can see now, we're hitting our controller through to our repository and hitting that get all method, which is returning our array of items here. Just to show this is working correctly, if I grab an ID, put it in here, we'll now hit the get all method and we return a single single entity here. That's working great. Okay, let's go on to the JavaScript API and talk about that in a little bit more detail. So what is the JavaScript API for? It's basically a library that allows us to marshal calls between our JavaScript and our controller and repository. It gives us a nice consistent way of working with our service. We're always going to be consuming our web service in a single way, in a standard way, and therefore we can predict the results that's coming back from our service. It's quite easy to use. Firstly, we reference in the JavaScript library. So this is the standard path to the JavaScript library as that comes in Sitecore. We then create an instance of entity service, and then we pass in the URL to our service. So this is not any actions or anything like that. It's directly to the actual controller. So you can see we're using the same routing URL there. A little bit more on the JavaScript API. It does auto mapping between your Pocket objects and the JavaScript. So if you have a string ID, when you pass that to the controller, it can map that into a GUID. It does mapping between date times as well. If you have a array of string, When we pass that through from the JavaScript, it will also map that into a list of string, for example. It also provides validation. It can load in custom validators that you've defined within your entity. So if you write this check whether that property is required, or you have a bit of client-side scriptifier that is handled for you. These are the functions you actually get with entity service, with the JavaScript library for entity service. So we have a fetch entities method. So this is going to return us all our entities. We have a fetch entity. When you pass in a string ID, we'll return single. Our destroy is our delete method. We have a save, so you pass in an item you want to update, basically, so that's the update method. We have a create method. We pass in a JSON representation of your entity, and it will create that. Okay, let's jump into Visual Studio, and we're going to create the page code for this application and actually call this JavaScript API. Okay, for this this application, I have two page codes because we've got two single pages on this application. So the first one here we'll have a look at. So as I said, the first thing we need to do is you need to require in, this is require.js, which speak, but you can also reference that in if you just use the standard JavaScript, to our entity service library. So this is just the JavaScript file. We're then going to use our entity service instance. So the first thing we need to do is we actually need to create an instance of entity service. So what I've done here, I've just created a method that we can call so we can instantiate entity service. So instead of copy and paste in, we've got a central place to create that reference, create that instance. So as you can see, we're just creating a new instance of entity service, and then we pass in our URL to our controller, and that'll give us an instance. The next thing we want to do on this page is actually get a list of all our brochures. So we want to hit the get all method. So the way this works, so a little bit of speak code in here as well, so I'll explain that as well. Basically we have a list control, which is a speak control, which allows us, it's a little bit like a repeater, where we can give it a template and it'll repeat that out for every item within our collection. So we have a data source which feeds off to this list control. We then call in our method to get our instance of entity service, and then we call in fetch entities. So this is called a promise in entity service and SSE. So this is kind of like what we do in LINQ at the moment. We can write a query using LINQ, and not until we call the toList, for example, does that query get executed. In entity service, this is called a promise. So we write a promise here, and not until we call execute is that that request to the API actually fired off. So as you can see here, when we execute this fetch entities, we're going to hit our controller, hit that get all method, and then that's going to return an array of JSON, so all our JSON entities, and then we're going to put that into our data source, which is bound to our list control. Just to show you how that works, if I go into Sitecore folder, so within this directory here we have a custom tile. So a custom tile is basically like a single item that we're going to display in our list control. So this is using Knockout.js. So this is part of Speak. As you can see here, we're going to be binding in our ID from our entity, our icon, and our title. So each one that is returned will get this display here, and that will get put on the front end. So that's our get all method. The other thing we want to do here is allow the user to select one and actually delete that brochure from the system. So to do that, I'll put this little code snippet in. So it's quite similar. We're again creating an instance of entity service. This time we're getting the selected item from a list control. So if you remember, right, I returned that item ID from our entity. That's for Speak. So that's what allows this piece of code to work. So when you select an item from that list control, we have that ID of that item selected. This time we're going to be calling fetch entity. So this takes an ID, a string ID, and returns a single entity. Again, you can see our promise being executed. So what we're doing here, we need to fetch a single entity before we want to work with it. In this case, delete it. So once this callback is done, we'll get our entity mapped into here, and then we're basically going to destroy on it. So once we call destroy, that's going to go through our controller into our repository and call the delete method. And then we do a little bit more speak code where we're sticking out a message into our message bar saying the item's been deleted successfully. And then we call in get brochures again, which will refresh that view and get fresh data. Let's jump into our second page code. So in here, this works pretty much the same. We're requiring that entity service and creating an instance of it, or using it, sorry. What we want to do here now is actually allow us to create an entity. So when the users fill this form in, when they press the save button, we want to create that instance in our Sitecore repository. So if I pull this bit of code in, again, we're creating an instance of entity service. What we're doing differently here is we're going to create a JSON representation of our entity. So we're going to pull all the values from the form. So we have our text box, title, introduction, our two case studies, which are tree views, and our data picker. So we're just going to basically make a JSON object here out of that data. What we're going to do then is call create on our service, and we're going to pass in that JSON representation of our entity. So this will pass that up to our controller and to our add method, and then we've written the implementation code to add that instance into Sitecore. And then once we've created that entity, the new entity is returned back, so we can do some validation if we needed to, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But all we're doing in this example at the moment is sticking out a success message to say whether the item was created successfully. If not, we're handing it down here by putting an error message up instead. The next thing we want to do is, once we've come from the first screen, if we'd edited an item, we press that edit button. We'll come to this page with a query string for the ID. So we want to load all the data from Sitecore about this item and pre-populate that form. So to do that, if I pull in my load method, we've already seen this. This is the same as our delete method when we had to get that entity first before we could work with it. So as you can see here, I've got a method down the bottom that gets the query string. Basically, we're going to call our standard code to get an instance of entity service, and we've seen this before. We're going to call fetch entity and pass in our ID, so this will go off and get our entity, and then the data is returned from service. We're mapping that into our text box, introduction and dates field, and so on. So that's quite similar to what we've seen before. The last thing we want to do here is allow the user, once they've made those changes to that entity, is allow them to save that. So this is the last one to look at. So this is the update code. So this works pretty much the same. You can see this kind of standard syntax coming in. So we're going to be building these services always in the same method and same framework. So we're calling the fetch entity again. When this entity is returned, we're going to update those field values based on what's on the form. So our text boxes are going to update these properties here. And then what we're going to do, we're going to subscribe to the save event. So when the save of this entity has been done and it's returned successfully, we want to do something. So we're saying here, this is our promise. So we want to subscribe to the save event. And then once it saves, we want to call this update successful method, which is by here, which just puts out a successful message. And then what we're doing then, we're calling we're executing our promise. So we're actually going to execute that save method, which is going to go off to our controller again. And then once that callback's done, we're going to hit this method here and put out a success message. Although I've been showing you this in Speak at the moment, you can consume this JavaScript API just as you would with another JavaScript library, so it doesn't have to be Speak, but we just use the Speak for this example. Okay, now we've got the basics of entity service working. Let's talk about extending entity service, pushing a little bit further and see what's possible. Okay, so as I mentioned, you can add custom actions to your controller. This is really easy to do. It sticks to standard web API actions, so there's nothing custom here. You can do what you've been doing all along. You can even extend your repository, so the Sitecore repository can be extended with additional functionality. I do have a blog which I'll show you a little bit later about this. One thing to note is when you add custom actions to your controller, it's not currently available through the JavaScript API. You can use jQuery to post to that action, that's not a problem, or hit it using REST calls, that's fine. The routing for custom actions is slightly different. So again, we use Sitecore/API/SSC, namespace to our controller name, and the ID and the action swap order. So this is just how we define a custom action. So they've just switched. I'm pretty sure you can update this if you needed to within the config files, but this is the standard. So let's write a custom action to show how that works. So jump into Visual Studio, we'll go into our controller. I have a code snippet here I can pull in. So as you can see here, we're using standard .NET code. We're marking up as a HTTP post method. We've called our action generate PDF. What we're going to do here is accepting a brochure that's been serialized to JSON from the form. We're then going to pass off to a method I've written here, which is going to generate a PDF. And once that PDF has been generated, we're going to push back the URL of that PDF back to the web browser so we can redirect and allow the user to download that PDF. Okay, let's jump back into our presentation. Okay, so extended validation. So as I mentioned earlier, we can write custom validation for our properties within our entities. So we can actually start to validate them the way we want to. This is based on standard .NET data annotations. We can provide the client-side validation and the server-side, so we can write both, and those validation scripts will get fired depending on we called it from the client-side or from the server-side from a REST call, for example. Any JavaScript we add as validation script is provided in the metadata of the service. So when we create an instance of entity service, that metadata is downloaded, and any validation script we've written will get passed down to the browser at the same time. So let's show you how this works to make a little bit more sense if we walk through it. So the first thing we need to do is actually write our validation attribute. So what we're going to do in this example here is we're going to write, let's pin this out a second, make more sense. We're going to write a bit of validation to allow the user, when they selected a date, to actually check whether the date is in the past or not. So we want to make sure this date is always in the future. It's just a bit of code example to show you what's possible. So what we need to do is actually implement validation attribute. So this is just standard.NET, so there's nothing Sitecore custom here. And all we need to do is write the server-side validation to check whether this property is valid. So what we've done here is overridden the isValid method. So the object that's passed in, so the value here, is going to be the value that's been selected by the user on the form. So we're going to cast that off to a date and just simply check whether it's greater than today's date or not, and return a success or an error message if it's not valid. So that's the server side done. So next we need to write the client side validation. Okay, so the way this works, Sitecore looks for validation in a directory. So this is Sitecore shell client services assets lib extensions validators. So it's the default location of where it loads its validators from. This is set within the Sitecore.Services.Client config, so you can append this if you needed to. If you want to change that location. So what we have to do here is write the client-side JavaScript validation that provides the same functionality the server side, but the JavaScript equivalent. So I'll pull that bit of code in. So what we're doing here, we're going into the validator collection within Entity Service, and we're adding a new one. So we give it a name. So we need to remember this name, because we'll need it in a bit. And then this works the same as the server side. So the value passed in is the value that's been selected and entered into that entity. And then we're doing the equivalent of JavaScript to what we did in the server side. So we're just checking whether that's bigger than today's date, so the current date. So that's the client side and server side validation written. What we need to do now is actually link the client and the server side together, so the service knows which two validations are linked. So to do that, we need to write some metadata. So we jump into here. If I bring this functionality in. So what we do here, we need to implement validation metadatabase. So this sits within Sitecore.Services core DLL. So you need to reference that in. You need to reference that in for all this functionality actually. We then pass into that our server-side validation. So this is our validation attribute. So that's referenced in there. Then on the constructor, we need to pass in the name of the client-side validation. So this is the name we've selected or specified here. So that's now linking the client and the server side together. The last thing we need to do is actually mark up our property within our entity of which we need to validate. So to do that, if we jump into our entity, which is here, so we can mark up this date. So we need to mark it up with our validation attribute. So this is not past date. So this will validate it. Of course, the validation to occur on both the client and the server side. The other thing we can do is we can specify a custom error message. So this will get delivered to the client side or the client side or the server side if this validation fails for this entity. So we can say should be in the future, for example. And when we try and create an item and it fails validation, it'll return this error message, and it won't call off to our service, it'll stop it at that point. Okay, this is something that actually caught me out when I started to learn Entity Service, so I'll just talk about this. So in the Sitecore documentation, you see a lot of this syntax here. So we say entity should be an instance of entity service.entity. Entity is new, should be false. Entity should have a property of title. So this is a certain bit of unit testing, validation, whatever you want to call it. Basically what Sitecore are using for this is unit.js. It's a nice little way of actually checking the data that returns from entity service. You can allow this, you can do some unit testing with this, or assert whether values are correct. If I just jump into Sitecore, I can walk you through that and it'll make a little bit more sense. So if we jump into our create page code, what we'll do, the first thing you need to do is require in unit. So this doesn't come with a standard install. If you just Google unit.js, you can find the library, copy that into your solution and into Sitecore, so it needs to sit in the client some way, and then you can reference that in, and then we'll use it here. What we're going to do in this example, when we've called brochure create, so this is when we create our brochure, we talked a little bit earlier, we can fire a bit of validation on here, or assert to check whether that entity has been created correctly and that is valid. So to do that, if I bring some code in, so as you can see here, it's a nice clean syntax, nice and easy to read. So we can say our new brochure, so this is the one we created, it will return that. We can say it should be an instance of entity service entity, and if this fails, it will go into our error message here. We can check whether is new is false. Because this is a bit of an odd one, because you've created your entity and it's been returned by that service, it's no longer new. If we had checked it up here, it would be new because we haven't passed off to the service to create it yet. We're also doing a check here to see whether our entity has a property called title and there's a type string. So we're checking that entity further. You can start to use the syntax a little bit more if you want to validate your data and do a bit of unit testing or integration testing. And if any of these fail, we'll catch it in this fail method here, and then we're going to put out that error message into a text box on the page. You can use the same method if you're doing your validation. So when we're creating our entity here, if we had a pass state in here, for example, this would fail. It will hit our fail method, and our error message, this return from our service, will be that custom message we specified earlier. So the one that's in our model, if I can show you quickly. So that will be this message here. That will show there as well. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is middleware. So middleware is a client-side bit of code, and it sits between the server side, so what gets returned from our controller, and our promise callback, so when we call create or add or so on, or query. It allows you to inject a little bit of client-side script to append to the model or update it or do something extra. So instead of copy and pasting that code or calling that code on each method, you can stick in the central place that every time an entity is returned, no matter what you do, it will call this client-side bit of code before it gets returned. Probably to show this a bit better, I think you need to see some code. So I've jumped back into Visual Studio, and we'll go into create method again. So if you ignore this is a bug fix I've had from Sitecore as a workaround for something. So on initialize, so this is the method that's called every time the page loads to set it up. We want to use the syntax here. So entity service.use. And this variable here, data, will be each entity that's returned. So this method will get called for every single item that's returned. So this will be a single entity. So what we can do, if I pull some code in, we can start appending to that entity. So what I've done here, I've added a timestamp property into our entity here. So this will be, so for example, if I do find by ID, which is this one. So before this method returns our variables in here, this bit of code will fire, append in a date stamp, which is just today's date and time, and it will return that. So when we get to this method here, that property will exist. So this, in this example, we're using it as a timestamp. This is basically the last time we called the server to refresh our data. And then we're going to call up to the next one, so we'll just keep passing on. So this will iterate through each item in our array, or each entity in our array. Okay, before we get to the questions, in the end, what we're going to do is build this, which will copy across all our files. And I'll show you the application working. Okay. Just clear the JavaScript. Great, so you can see we have our list of brochures now pulling in from Sitecore. We can create a new one. Just wait for Sitecore to pre-compile that speak page. Okay, so we can add a new one in. choose our date picker as an introduction. We can then select a case study. We can then go and pick an image from Sitecore, so we'll choose this one here, and then we can save it. So you can see, alright, it's been created successfully. We can update it as well. So, oops, we got 2. So item updated, same message. We can then generate our PDF. So as you can see, we got our title coming in, our introduction, the case study we've picked, we're actually pulling content in from that case study, so challenge, solution, and so on. And there's our image being rendered in. Just ignore my really poor PDF writing skills, but you can see we're actually reusing that content using Entity Service. So we go back. If we enter some more data, if we choose a date in the past, and we select another image, I'll choose the same image, and we save that. So you can see our entity is invalid, so our validation has been successful and it's actually failed it because the date's in the past. If we then go back to the form, we can also call our delete method, so that's working as well. So finally, I have a number of blog posts on Entity Service, so you can visit this URL here. This application itself is on GitHub. I also have another Entity Service demo, which is a one-page application which has all the events going, so you can see how that works. Feel free to send me a tweet on Twitter if you wish, and just to leave you with our sponsors.